That's right, thank you, Scott. Hello, everyone. I don't want to keep you too much from your drinks and your food, but it's great to be here today. Obviously, some of you may know me from previous life. I was at URSA, and we worked very closely together with Scott and the IEP team. So thank you for having me here today. I am the Director of Policy at a youth charity called Impetus. So I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about the research we've been doing. Since I joined, we've launched a national report with the Minister for Employment, Heidi Allen, who you may have seen in the press. I'm not going to mention the B word, so I'm not going to get into the politics of this. But I did want to run you through the findings of that research and some of the implications for the employment support sector. The focus is young people, youth employment. We don't really see much about that in the headlines anymore. It's all very positive news. And what we've been able to do is dig below those sort of positive headlines and look at what some of the actual issues are facing some of those young people. So, it's called the Youth Jobs Gap, which some of you may have seen. Some may have seen some of our work on this. We've undertaken some research to try and better understand those issues that are facing young, disadvantaged people in particular. That's who Impetus is particularly interested in supporting through our charity partners. This is, I should say, this piece of work is the first of a series of reports, which comes from a very rich data set, which I shall tell you about in a second, working with an organisation called NISA and SIVA, who have helped to deliver these findings. So when we've done our previous research at Impetus, we've used what you all know as the Labour Force Survey, which is a great tool in and of itself. It's a very regular survey of the labour force. And we tried to look at the young people who are NEET in the country. People who are NEET at a certain point in time, and people who cycle in and out of being NEET. I should say NEET, I think, is a terrible, terrible term. It's one we all use, one that I hope you know not in education, employment or training. I will, as part of my job, endeavour to find a better term than NEET, but it's what I shall use today. We found through using the Labour Force Survey, so the DWP's data, we found that around 2 million young people spend at least some time NEET. 800,000 were NEET for a year or more. This is actually quite old, the numbers. It's 2014, I think, is when we did that. So obviously that was when NEET rates were a lot higher than they are today. But the thing that we found most through doing that piece of work was that the Labour Force Survey really couldn't tell us a huge amount of the things that we were really interested in, which was, where are these young people? Which local authorities do they sit in? What's their background? What are their qualifications? You know, what are some of that really rich information that tells us something about the people that we need to support? In the world of education, there is the National Pupil Database, which has oodles and oodles and oodles of data on all the pupils that go through school. But in employment, I think we all know that we don't have that. Individual organisations working with people have their own data, but actually, on the whole, we don't have access to that kind of rich employment information. Well, we didn't until we got access to something called LEO, L-E-O, Longitudinal Education Outcomes Data. I'll explain what that is. So, we have the National Pupil Database, as I mentioned. We have HE stats, we have individual learner records, we have HMRC tax receipts. So, in the system of government, there is a Sam Windett that knows, I'm Sam Windett. There is information on Sam Windett that knows I went to school in Buckinghamshire. It knows what qualifications I got. It knows I went to university at Leeds. It also knows I now work at Impetus and I'm paying tax. I am paying tax, just to clarify that. But those things didn't talk to each other. So all these bits of government we know don't talk to each other. They were sitting in different areas. What LEO does is it joins all of those together. So it can essentially track Sam Windett through all of that journey to say, okay, so you've got these qualifications, you have this background, you went to this university, and you now are working at Impetus with this earnings and paying tax. Not many people have access to this. So when I have presented this to other researchers, they have been incredibly jealous about the information that we can get at. I should say that I mentioned NISA. NISA actually has the data. We are able to analyze it. So I'm not able to see an individual, but I am able to see the cohorts and the types of individuals we're talking about. So you probably want to know what the findings are. First, I just need to talk through what I'm about to present to you about young people and their employment prospects. This is a technical bit I won't spend too long on. There is, let me just make sure I've got the right piece of paper. Yeah, so cohorts are effectively school year groups. We have information on 500,000 young people each year. So it's the people who sat their GCSEs. And it covers cohorts between 2007 to 2012. So that's 6 sets of leavers that go all the way up to 2017. So the most recent data that we could get our hands on. Disadvantage, I'm going to speak about, and I do talk about disadvantage a lot. When we talk about this information, it's we're basing it on free school meals, so pupils eligible for free school meals. The reason for that is you'd do it now if you ran it now on pupil premium, but pupil premium didn't exist back in this time. So the only way we could get consistency was young people on free school meals in year 11. Let me just make sure my notes make sense. I'm going to talk about local authority and region. That's the local authority that young people went to school, not where they end up. Qualification. We use 3 buckets for qualification. High qualification is A-level or equivalent. Middle is 5 GCSEs or equivalent. And low is young people who are low qualified have fewer than 5 GCSEs. So that's how we've banded it. Now, eat and neat. People are neat if they're not eat, which kind of is obvious, right? But we're taking eat in any given month if there's earning or learning recorded. And as I say, that's up to March 2017 coming through. And then just on age, that's when people were in the same school year. So it's not necessarily when everybody turned their birthdays, but we're using them as their school year. So having explained all that, the other bit, this is England only. If anybody wants to talk about Scotland or Wales and running the same thing there, do get in touch. But this is England only. Here we go. So young people, what we found was disadvantaged young people are twice as likely to be neat as their better off peers. That is the first big finding from our research that we've published in April. I think that for most of us is not a huge surprise. What we can see here is the disadvantaged young people in the blue, non-disadvantaged in the green, and the gap in between. Pretty consistent over the years. So it is not a point in time. That gap is consistent across all of the groups we looked at. But we do think that measuring it, what you can measure, you can change. So measuring this is important. But also it's the scale of that impact. Twice as likely to be neat. So other types of impact that governments looked at that have an impact like that are, for example, people with substance misuse issues or caring responsibilities. This is purely on receiving free school meals. And that's 1 in 8 pupils who meet that definition. So that's a pretty big finding, and our first one. The employment gap is consistent over time, as you can see. Actually, the NEET rate always changes. Although the NEET rate itself has changed, the gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged young people remains. And over the period we've looked at, they rise and fall, but it's persistent regardless. So overall, if we're talking numbers, that equates to 78,000 extra disadvantaged young people who are NEET, who wouldn't be if the gap didn't exist. So we're talking about quite big numbers here. This is about, I said about where are these young people? And that's a really, really important question, particularly as policy making becomes ever more regional and local. How can we help the mayors shape what happens in their combined authorities? How do we help local authorities to do that? Well, you can look at it on a regional basis. And we found that the gap is pretty consistent across the regions. London, you can see, is the big exception. We'll talk a little bit about that. We see much more variability in the NEET rate for disadvantaged young people compared to non-disadvantaged, but it's sort of 1 or 2 percentage points. It's not a huge amount. And you can see the Northeast here, as you know, does stand out as well. The finding is a disadvantaged young person is about 50% more likely to be NEET in the Northeast compared with London. That's what we found here. But actually, one of the biggest findings we had was that there was a bigger variation within each of these regions. So the difference between some of the local authority areas within this region was stark. And we're actually going to be publishing a set of regional reports from this one, starting with the Northwest in June, looking at actually what does that look like for local authority to local authority. So now, if I asked you why, people here in the room know about London very well, why do you think London is different? You may think that it's qualifications. We know that London does very well in qualifications. So is all we found actually that young people do better when they're better qualified? The answer is actually no, and I shall go on to suggest why. Here we go. First, I'll show you quickly NEET rate by qualification. So as I described it as low qualified, middle qualified, high qualified. As you'd expect, the better qualified you are, the lower your chances of being NEET. That's rather obvious. But it is interesting that the jump between the 5 GCSEs and the below 5 GCSEs is much bigger between the low and the middle than between the middle and the high. So it's much better to be going from low to middle than it is from middle to high. It increases your chances much more. And over time, levels of qualification have improved for both disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged young people. So you can compare bars of the same colour here. You can see here disadvantaged young people have increased the percentage of being qualified, high qualified. You can see here in the green, that's non-disadvantaged. Comparing the different colours in the same years, you can see how much more likely disadvantaged young people are to be low qualified. But while the share of the young people with low qualifications has been falling, we're not actually seeing a share of the young people who are NEET falling. So, slide 10. The proportion of low qualified young people who are NEET has barely changed in recent years, even though the proportion of young people with low qualifications has fallen. So you're much less likely to get to 18 with low qualifications in 2012 than in 2007. But actually, if that's your situation, you're no less likely to be NEET. At any given point, around 30% of low qualified young people, a group that is disproportionately disadvantaged, are NEET. London doesn't stand out when looking at NEET rates for differently qualified young people. So, on the regional figures, I talked about London. London has the opposite feature now. If you see, it's here. It's noticeably higher NEET rates in the middle and high qualified groups. And although the chart is 2017, it's in no way isolated just to 2017. So, we're going to compare disadvantaged young people to their similarly qualified but better off peers, and combine these two sets of findings to make one great big finding, which we got through our research. At all levels of qualification, so that's the low, the middle, and the high, disadvantaged young people are 50% more likely to be NEET than their better off peers with similar qualifications. That was our biggest finding of all of this research, and not one that we set out to find. It actually wasn't our hypothesis at the beginning. We hypothesized that qualifications would have an impact, and actually qualifications have the biggest impact. It's 50%. So of all factors, qualification is the biggest factor, but it only explains 50% of why disadvantaged young people are becoming NEET compared to their better off peers. This is quite a profound finding. What causes that gap is something that this data doesn't tell us, but I think people in the room can definitely help come up with that answer. We know young people suffer from Disadvantaged young people might not have the social capital. They might have those caring responsibilities. They might have a disability or health condition of their own. We know actually adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma can result in some of these factors. And they're all things that have potential to impact on a young person's potential, but they also have potential to impact on their employment prospects as well. So, here we go. This is the main findings. Disadvantaged young people twice as likely to be NEET. Half the gap can be explained by qualification, half cannot. And the picture really, really varies across the country. And I'm sure you'll be seeing that in your services, with bigger variation within them between the regions. So we're now planning to release more reports. This was our biggest finding, but each of the detailed findings is equally interesting when you're talking to commissioners across the country, which we will be doing. I'm really keen to work with people who want to feed into these recommendations. So we're actually going to produce a list of policy recommendations in a year or so, because what we wanted to do was digest the research, work with people who know what they're talking about and can help us form the so what. So what? So what about this research? What are we going to do about it? And what do we want policymakers to do about it? What do we want commissioners to do about it? And how do we want to shape services to respond to this? So really my biggest plea today is if you want to work with us on this series of reports, please do get in touch. Thank you.